Welcome to Who Shaves the Barber, a weekly podcast where we explore paradoxes, thought experiments, and other pointless problems. I'm William Nava. Last week, in part 1 of my interview with Brian Nuckols, Brian walked us through the history of dream interpretation, from the pre-Socratics up through to Nietzsche. I recommend you listen to that episode before this one, as we make some references to what was discussed there in this episode. You can find it at williamnava.podbean.com. Today, Brian continues by walking us through the views of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. Yeah, so I imagine it'll be worthwhile to talk quite a bit about Freud. So before actually going into his interpretation of dreams, can you just kind of give like broad overview of just the Freudian picture of the world and of the psyche?
Yeah, sure. So I think, this is kind of bad form but I'm going to start with the sociological, put it in historical context, because I think post birth control, that's really significant. I don't think historically it's even hard for me. And I've really looked at this, the idea of how different sex is for someone in 2017 compared to, let's say, 1901. And I would say, I think the invention of birth control is really significant. And I also think, it's easier for us to understand the impact of syphilis because we've somewhat recently had AIDS to deal with. But, sex is really, really dangerous at this time, really dangerous. And even if adjusting for inflation, and everything, I think 70% of the population is living on $1 a day, something like that. So lots of poverty, and sex is just extremely dangerous. So I think that really colors his analysis of the psyche. He has eros and theranos, death drive and sex drive, life drive or sex drive are kind of key to him. And he's interested in neurosis and how these things cause the inability to integrate the instinctual part of our brain, of our unconscious, conceptualized in Freud as the id, with culture, which is the civilization. And he's pretty Darwinian, and he kind of has this sync of this kind of higher brain function kind of synchronizing with a developing culture, a civilizing culture. And so we have this civilizing, to Freud, we have this civilizing superego that is kind of interested in integrating the death and sex drive into an ego, into a personality. And that should go well, and that's fine. However, it doesn't in certain cases, which were usually around parenting to Freud. Moms and dads failing in some way. And so this would create neurosis, a kind of hypercritical superego, or a superego that's not critical enough, or some kind of issue there. And his main technique is going to be cathartic. So you just kind of have to let them speak, like the repression speak. That's the Freudian, I'd say, technique. Did you want to say something? Go ahead.
So it sounds like for him, it's all about the balancing act between the superego and the id. And the proper balance is going to be psychic health. You were saying something, I don't think I quite understood it, about the role of culture in his eyes. So I understand that the role of parenting is, I guess to raise the child in such a way where this harmony or balance between the superego and the id is appropriate. What were you saying about the role of society or of culture in this?
Yeah, so I would say, you could look at three figures to understand this. You could look at the masters of suspicion. You've got Marx, you've got Nietzsche, you've got Freud. And I think to understand that point, and I think they're fundamentally pretty wrong, but you've got this kind of idea of almost a Yeah, I would say a Darwinian progression of culture, of civilization, kind of going from, let's say, Neanderthals to 19th century England. Um, and in Marx's case, continuing on to something better, right? But it's very mechanical. And I think Marx is explicitly Darwinian. I think he's really into, I'm not an expert there, and we don't have to go there. But I think, yeah. And so I think he has this idea that the superego kind of evolved later in the brain. And that's where, it is kind of older, and that's where the kind of mismatch comes from, or the difficulty in integrating it. And because they're confused why people, and they're like, because people didn't stop having sex, right? I mean, like even with syphilis and being poor, like and not having birth control, like it's still, and they just didn't get it. They couldn't wrap their heads around it, why that would happen. Like the central planners, let's say, like the people trying to figure this all out.
They didn't get why people were just not having sex.
Yeah, I think they had a kind of overly romantic view of the superego, perhaps. That would be a criticism I would throw. And I think I want to be careful with criticizing Freud too much, because it's one of those things where, like, we're still talking about you 117 years later. Like, all of his good ideas are just so fundamental to the way we look at the world about the unconscious. Like the idea that we had a sub-personality controlling our behavior, which is just intuitive. Like, that you don't want to go to, like, you want to go to the gym, but you don't. Like, let's say, like, we're pretty comfortable with this idea that it's not like some kind of sin that we're not doing. It's actually like a process, an autonomous unconscious, like maybe we're not engaging with that idea every day, but it's uncontroversial, right? And that was revolutionary and he got a ton of criticism from that. And even the behaviorists after that disparaged him for a long time. And he was right about that. So I do want to give Freud credit, but what's kind of left over that we're still kind of interrogating can, he can come off as like kind of silly almost in some ways. And I don't think that's really fair. But yeah, so
this could be too much of a tangent, but do you think that there's a way in which the fact that his theory of the sort of levels of the psyche became such a basic part of how we interpret ourselves, that may have actually kind of led to a more kind of divided view of the psyche than there was before, in such a way that actually that might be a self-fulfilling prophecy? Like, do you think there's any possibility that people prior to Freud, because this wasn't such an accepted idea, that people were actually less sort of internally split, which is something that you see so often now, people having a sense of like, there's part of me that this, but there's part of me that.
That's interesting. So I think, I think that does make sense. And I think I think society has kind of developed. I think as we make these discoveries, it becomes. I think the roles in society now are maybe less aren't. How to say this? Like I think and this goes back to all the myths, right? Like there's this kind of curse component to self-knowledge, and it becomes harder to kind of comport yourself in society with some of these ideas, which kind of turns into a kind of a loop. Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think that and maybe if we get into some of the dangers of lucid dreaming, and I think that is definitely one, is like all the hero stories are like, if you go, and you might not want to go and find the dragon, right? Like you don't always get the princess. Like sometimes you get your head bit off. That's the myth, right? So how I'm hearing your question is like, is it better to be repressed, right? are there cases where repression is like a evolutionary strategy, say?
Well, I think my question is more about, so I'm working from a certain assumption, and that assumption is that if a certain picture of the psyche or of ourselves becomes thoroughly prevalent and saturated in society, that's actually going to affect us by making us more like that, right? Like if even if we, regardless of whether we were that way to some extent or not, we're going to become more that way if we thoroughly accept this picture throughout society in this very fundamental way. And so my sort of speculation is, the sort of picture of the psyche in which we're split between an unconscious and the superego and all that, right? My speculation is it possible that pre-Freud that was actually not as much the case, but because we've become so saturated with Freudian ideas, that's actually more the case for us now.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like this phenomenon. It's one of the critiques I'll have of because I'm really interested in therapeutic modalities, right? And one phenomenon you see, and it's a big problem, is like when someone's diagnosed, there's a certain enhancement of the symptoms. And we see that a lot. And yeah, it does seem to be an amplification there when something is kind of, and I think this is something I haven't been able to investigate like really thoroughly, but the nature of what a placebo is, and a nocebo as well, is another one they're looking at. And we do seem to have this kind of ability to inflate things, like material things. And yeah, and I think that is definitely, I think that has happened to an extent with subpersonalities, definitely. But I do think there's other aggregating factors as well, which is, there's certain philosophers that look into it. There's the one from Baudrillard. I know I'm butchering his name, the French guy.
I have no idea how to pronounce it. I don't even try.
Yeah, but you've got this idea of, like he talked about, I really giggled at it. It was like he's from Europe and he went to Disney World, and the food, like they have like the Swiss, they have the world, they have like each country you can go to in Disney World. I've never been there, but you can go to like Switzerland and they have all Swiss food and people dress. He's like, this is the best Switzerland I've ever been to. And yeah, it's this idea of kind of copying things and I think in some ways, a lot of culture right now is kind of especially let's say television, is kind of depth psychology in reverse.
What do you mean by that?
So what I mean by that is, actually, for me to explain that, can we jump to Jung really quickly? Because I think temporally Jung comes after Freud, right? But if we look at what Freud's project as like the basement of the unconscious, like I think Jung excavates deeper. And I think the point I'm trying to make is we have the ability now to project things further. And the more we can project like our kind of, let's say, unconscious phenomenon onto the outer world, the easier it is to split because there's more to project onto. But like, I think Freud's interpretation of kind of death and sex, I think. So a good example of this is like, to Freud, a steeple must be a penis. Mm-hmm. It must be. It has to be. That's what it is. A key in a lock. I won't go into details, but what that has to mean something very specific to Freud, where Jung kind of takes this more mythic, like that could be opening a door, a church steeple. A funny quip, like Jung, the reason I brought up the steeple one is Jung says, how I've had dreams of penises, like how do I interpret that? If a church steeple is a penis. We just kind of quipped that. I thought that was kind of funny. So I think that my point about depth psychology, the kind of the phenomenon of a idealized Switzerland being depth psychology in reverse, I think moves us further from, like, when I say Switzerland, actually, I think that's a pretty good example because that...
Well, actually, let me stop you for a moment. So what is depth psychology?
Depth psychology is the method so Freud's psychoanalysis is somebody's neurotic and in some way, let's say schizophrenic, and what he'll do is he kind of has his complex, the relationship with the mom, et cetera, all these death and sex drives, and you do a free association technique, like say the first thing about your mom, and then you kind of overwhelm the ego, and eventually start crying, and then be like, why are you crying? And then you kind of dig from there. Well, Jung kind of refined this process using depth psychology, and the two core techniques are dream analysis and active imagination. And obviously the topic today is dream analysis. So what you would do is you would keep your dream journal, you would report it, and you would use a technique. You can use it, and people have different processes. This is from my reading of Jung. But you would do something called cluster thinking. And essentially what that is okay, you have a steeple, okay? And maybe the first thing that comes to your mind is a penis, but okay, what's the second thing? And so we'll have that here, and you kind of build a cluster. And then the analyst will start kind of chatting about different myths, make different associations, and kind of like, how do you feel about this? Like, and just kind of try to get to, let's say, the gist or the essence or the archetype, which we might have to unpack, of the particular symptom. And I think why I made that point of, I think it's very easy now to move far away from that. Like there's an infinite amount. So the kind of opposite of that process, it would be like, let's say we get down to the gist, and the problem is you're angry about a stage of childhood development, let's say. And you go living in 2017, there is no shortage of things to project your anger onto, right? Like you don't need to understand why you're angry. Like there's plenty of things to be angry about. Like you can go on Facebook and find atrocities for days if you want to. And the kind of Baudrillard's point is the kind of phenomenon of making better things to be angry at, like with the kind of algorithms that we're working with, like that just becomes easier and easier to project onto, which is, to Jung, is a problem, right? Well, if you want to understand why you're actually angry, it would be a problem.
So you're talking about first of all, there's this process of projection, right? Which is the process of, you've got some internal neurosis or something that's fundamentally an internal psychic problem, and you project it onto some other person or some other issue, and you make it about them. And so the process you're describing is a kind of proliferation of objects of projection.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which makes it just all the more easy to go to projection, and by virtue of that makes you sort of more kind of removed from understanding yourself.
Exactly. And just less likely to run out of things to be mad at. Like, one of the core moments.
And I guess also a bit maybe more split as well, right?
Absolutely. I think the reason I got down that road, because I think you made a really good point about, that in a strange way that, that the process itself, and I think this gets to a fundamental issue with the unconscious. Andrew, like it doesn't want to be observed. It seems like there's a component of it, that's a there seems to be a kind of split, and I think this is the core insight of psychoanalysis, is the unconscious. There's a reason it's unconscious. What's the word I want to use? I don't want to say prevent, but it resists analysis in a lot of ways. And so that, I think.
Well, if the picture of the unconscious is at all like the Freudian picture of that's where, the house of the primal drives, then in a sense it makes sense, right? Like whoever the analyst is, even if it's you yourself,
yes,
you probably are trying to find this stuff to like repress it and like integrate it in a really nice and healthy way. And, presumably those primal drives just want to do their thing kind of uninhibited, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe we could talk about, cool. So, that there is, I think this is interesting. I actually have a diagram. Maybe you can flash it I'll send it to you, and maybe you can flash it for your users, because I kind of made it when I was thinking about this. And I think there's definitely, so I like to call it the basement, the Freudian unconscious, which is valid, is there. Underneath that, I think we also have like this kind of affective or emotional unconscious that I think, so Jung has this archetype idea. So you have these personal archetypes, you'll have a shadow, which I think that's permeated into popular culture pretty well. Maybe I can just say one thing. I would just invite any of your brave listeners to do a practice that you can see if like the shadow is something that's real in their unconscious. So maybe I'll just diagram before we talk about that. I'll just we talked about the Freudian psyche. So the Jungian psyche is a little different. So maybe I'll just outline that real quick, and then I can jump into the shadow. Because I think his psyche does have kind of I think one problem with the unconscious is, first of all, the unconscious isn't unconscious if with depth psychology we can access it, right? So I think that's kind of a misnomer, and but there's definitely procedural memory, which is like how your blood flows, that I think is probably truly unconscious. But maybe we'll get there with the dangers of lucid dreaming. But anyways, there's this kind of floor underneath that I like to call the affective unconscious, that it seems to be populated by these kind of Jungian archetypes. So can I jump into that real quick? Does it sound good?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so first we'll have like me and you talking right now, and like Jung would call that the persona, and that would be kind of what you would put. I like to say the Instagram version of me. Like even for some reason, like on Twitter, it's less of my persona and more of it. But like Instagram, like is a persona thing, at least in my experience. It's like what you would want other like attractive, good-looking people to know about you. That is, I think, the persona, okay? And then what I think is interesting about Jung's ego is he also makes room for this kind of, like, what you would tell, like, say, your therapist or your partner, like, what is the worst, quote-unquote, the things you are most scared of about yourself that is conscious, that you're maybe not engaging, but you know about it. And that is encapsulated within the Jungian ego. And from the persona, if you look at the persona, the ego, and I almost look at that, the Jungian ego as kind of a mediator on this axis from persona through ego to shadow. And shadow, Jungian shadow is just, something that would just, okay. There's in childhood, I want to explain the gravity of the shadow, because I think I like to use this word called banalized. I think a lot of things now in like the self-improvement like industry or whatever are just banalized. I think this is a huge thing I'm against. It's like, it's hard to express things when there's this tendency to banalize, like, oh, it's the shadow. Like, yeah, I'm an evil prick, whatever. Like, no, like what I want people to do to understand the shadow is like, if they're really interested in it, it's a really intense experience, but there's, the diary of, the Columbine killer. I forget his name right now, but read it.
Dylan something.
Dylan. And then there's another one about this horrific individual who he claims to have raped 1,200 boys in as he was in homes. Like it's just a really horrific story. Great writer, like shockingly intelligent. It's really freakish to read. And then you also have the kind of mythic experiences of the state in our culture, which would be like, let's say, the concentration camps, and we have maybe the Gulag, like Stalin's thing too. So what you want to do is you want to like be that person in some way. Like you want to read about them and experience yourself as them, especially with. And this is a frightening process because like definitely all of us. I mean, the vast majority of people as a guard in a concentration camp does not act as you'll say you would act just from the persona, right? Like you've got family, you're embedded in Nazi Germany. Like I think that is an excellent way to interrogate where you, who you are as a person. And I think that's how you kind of get in touch with the shadow in some way. And it can be really troubling. And so if you're embarking on that kind of process, I think it would be really interesting to pay attention to your dreams and kind of see where your morality stems, for example, something like that. So I think these kind of figures to Jung that I'm talking about are projected outwards, and through the process of what he would call individuation, this goes away. And he actually got name-checked, Jung did, at the Nuremberg trials because he had made a comment that Hitler is a projection of the culture. And it's not Hitler and the Germans that should be blamed, but it's those who refuse to go through that don't accept that they are Hitler in some sense, to paraphrase him. And so that's obviously a big idea and pretty controversial, I would say.
So can we actually go a little bit more into that idea? We're kind of veering a little bit off of dream analysis, but I'm okay with that. I was hoping to get into psychology stuff anyway, because I find this really, I find this topic really interesting. I find that in the world of sort of political philosophy and social psychology, it's something that I think is not really addressed enough. Okay. That our villains, so right now, 2017 United States, I can't help but think of Trump, our big villain. I have no idea what his life is like, and what his like day to day is like, and that just, itself seems irrelevant. But what he has become is the object of such a tremendous amount of discourse and emotional expression. People get into fights in their families about him, and people constantly read about him, write about him. It's just like this sort of fixation, and I'm not, I'm not judging it. Like, you care about politics, he's doing some terrible things, so you care. That's fine. But just from a sociological perspective, you got to see that there's this like tremendous fixation. And I'm really interested by the idea that what's going on there is something like projection that we've talked about, but on a mass scale. And that somebody like Trump is essentially the picture of those parts of ourselves that we would rather not see. which in a way makes him a tragic figure, right? He's just this like thing that we conjured up and is just must be miserable because we just put all of the worst parts of ourselves onto him. Yeah, so that's kind of like the way I've loosely thought about it. Can you say more about your thoughts on this type of interpretation of politics and like social phenomena?
Yeah. So I think, I mean, not to get really existential here, but I think it's a lot easier to, because there seems to be kind of an inherent cruelty to childhood, let's say. Like, it seems to me to be impossible to raise a child without trauma, without some form of trauma. Like, because a lot of it is irrational. Like, for example, like we need to socialize children not to be playful, right? Like, because it's too irrational. That has to happen for them to fit in our society. And I think it's a lot easier. I mean, just for me trying to reconcile this phenomenon, because I completely agree that, I mean, I think that's just rampant. So what I'm trying to say is I think it's a lot easier to have a fight over Thanksgiving about your, like, wow, dad, like Trump, like that's pretty foolish, than it is to kind of have a fight that like you screamed at me when you were toilet training me and I haven't recovered from it yet and I probably won't. Like, so I think it's that it makes sense to me why it occurs. And I completely agree that it's, well, I mean, what I wish there'd be a more broad acceptance of psychoanalysis in, like, you do have like Lacan, like you have a leftist stream of people of thinkers that use it, but I don't think it's been used broadly, and I wish it would be, so the field would move further. I must say I'm not a huge expert on political theory, but I mean, I see it everywhere. And it's not only in Trump. I mean, I think another interesting one to look at is you've got this idea of the special snowflake, which is broadly coming from Trump, people who support Trump, who attacking the people you were talking about who are projecting onto Trump. And in reality, I mean, the kind of on the nose Jungian interpretation would be the people who are really upset about Trump, like they need to get in contact with some kind of inner tyrant, or they need to accept that there's a fascist part of them that keeps them alive in some way. And I mean, I think it's blatantly obvious that like a big part of kind of social, like mainstream social conservatism, I think a huge problem is this kind of revulsion of joining, because like collectivism not as an enemy, because it kind of, I don't know, it kind of reduces your individual importance. Like you never kind of, a projection of not being a special, unique person to me kind of is a cry to, like, why have I never got this attention? Like, you know, kind of, you know, a special snowflake, essentially. Like, I'm a unique person that's never been heard. And if we had a democratic society, like maybe I'll never get that. Perhaps. I mean, broadly, kind of my Facebook psychoanalyzing, looking into it, like it's very clear to me that on both sides that there's a heavy level of projection going on. It's pretty annoying, honestly.
So, like the people who sort of project Trump as their villain are Trump is their repressed sort of tyrannical impulses, and then the people who project the special snowflakes as their villains are themselves people who kind of seem to have some kind of bitterness about their individuality not being respected and affirmed in some way.
Well, if you just look at the theology of, like, let's say the Bible Belt, like certain like it's literally this kind of predestined, like I am God, like this group of people, like we are God, we are the holy ones. And yeah, I think that's pretty insidious I think that breeds a lot of, I think, like, not interrogating that in yourself, I think that breeds a lot of projection onto, like these. I think another one is just is like a kind of projected fear of utopia, like an actual fear of improving, like, or trying to improve and putting your all into it and just failing miserably, which happens, right? I think it's a lot easier to say no, like, you're just an idiot and nothing will improve ever. And I think you see that one as well. So to bring it back around to dreams, I think it's almost impossible. Like, if you're in a church, say, or in a democratic socialist of America, Antifa type thing, it's like being an alcoholic, right? Like, if your unconsciousness is embedded within, like, a social reality that makes up your entire identity, it's going to be hard to confront that consciously. I think those kind of structures are literally, well, we know that those structures are developed by the prefrontal cortex, like they must be. So I think it's really attractive to interrogate this kind of stuff through the avenue of dreams, because you can kind of, and you kind of, like, can take the color off it in a way. Like, things become mythic and not necessarily your parents, or they become energetic. Like, I don't want to say energetic, because I definitely don't want to go down that road, because no, but they become, like, metaphorical, let's say. And I think that's just, especially when you're starting, like, when you don't know, because you're going to be completely ignorant of that fact to start off with. So I think that's why dream analysis is so attractive to Jungians, if that makes sense. Because if you're embedded in this kind of social structure, I mean, that would be extremely jarring to become conscious, right?
So, now that you've kind of given a broad picture of the Jungian vision of the psyche and the Freudian one,
Yes.
I have two questions. I want you to say a little bit more about what actually is different about Jung's, because it seems at first glance like the persona, ego, shadow seems to map pretty well to, like, the superego, ego, id. So, what makes Jung's version more than just a switch in, a change in names? Let me actually just start you with that, and then I'll give you the other question I had.
Okay, so we have, with Jung, we have a kind of personal unconscious underneath the id, I would say, that kind of, and I have a diagram to show this, but it kind of, like, your impulses will kind of bleed from this kind of unconscious that is, we have the shadow that we talked about that can definitely be processed through, like, the id, but we also have all kinds of other complexes that Jung looked at. And I think especially around food is really interesting in modern time, because so I would look at this, like, if you look at some kind of some modern, like, let's say, behavioral science, is you have this idea, and this is actually really well developed in cognitive behavioral therapy, actually, but you have this idea of, like, a trigger, an action. You see this, and then a dope serotonin reward, and it actually creates, like, neural networks that like become codified and become more powerful. So, like, when there's a stress, that's how addiction happens, right? So if there's any kind of stress reaction, what will happen is this neural network will light up, and you'll get, like, a craving for a cigarette, say, and then you act on it, and it becomes stronger. And so Jung developed, like, kind of developed that idea, but he looked at it from like looking at those triggers as kind of expressions of separate archetypes. So I think the shadow really will activate some of the aggression and the sex, or it can. But we also have this idea in Jung called the anima and the animus, which is kind of repressed. It's very gendered. And I think this is actually one of the most exciting parts about modern Jungian psychology is that we're starting to, with, I guess, let's say, more openness in culture. We're starting to see some variations from this. But kind of in classic Jung is like, you're a guy, like you have this kind of repressed feminine aspect. And it's, yeah. And I would say that's kind of underneath the Freudian conception of the id in some ways. Like it's, to Jung, like it's, I guess you could say hungry, or it wants to express itself, let's say. And it often, I think this is to Jung what falling in love is. Honestly, is a projection of the anima. And I do want to say that is we don't necessarily, we can't live in a state of consciousness to Jung. We just want to be aware of the projection, so it's healthy, right? So I think to Jung, this is a fundamental part of being a human, is having an unconscious. So, but yeah, to Jung, so to Jung, for a man, you will fall for a woman, and vice versa. That is your inner picture, kind of your unconscious picture of the anima. Yeah, and I think what really is different about Jung from Freud is, so the poet W.B. Yeats has this idea of like the great memory, and that's the collective unconscious for Jung. It's not like the unconscious is kind of a faculty of the human and not something that is kind of, for Freud, biologically developed, from let's say a blank slate almost. I would say the biggest difference between Jung and it's hard for me because he doesn't really explicitly say, talk about the ontology of an archetype. But to me, what it looks like is kind of returning back to our history. It's like, if you say that, if you look at, if you look at how Kant interpreted Plato, say, you have these kind of forms of knowledge, a priori. I think for Jung, that is the collective unconscious is this kind of ancestral pool of memory that contains within it these structures of knowledge that are autonomous, and they kind of exist to, and this is my interpretation of Jung, right? So, and maybe Hillman too, James Hillman, later Jungians. He doesn't really write this down explicitly. This is my interpretation, so I want to put that out there. If you want to, the data is coming from archetypes of the collective unconscious, which is the 8th volume of his collected works, where he kind of explicates this. So we have that kind of, these knowledge forms kind of, they seem to exist to want to express themselves to Jung. They want to, or to experience themselves. And they do that through humans in some way. And And the best way to investigate them for Jung is to dream, right? And he, and then kind of in that mythopoetic Runa sense, he painted a lot. So the red book would be the one to look at through the figures in Jung's unconscious. Yeah. I think that's the big difference to Freud. It's not nearly that sexy. It's just wish fulfillment, transference. You have some, I would say a shallow, and I don't mean that as kind of a pejorative, but it's more shallow and perhaps more rigorous to some.
So this is something that I've always found interesting about Jung, is that his ontology is so elusive. And And sometimes I wonder if he just avoided being really clear about his ontology because being a scientist was really important to him, and so he didn't want to come out as a mystic.
Yes.
Or if, on the other hand, his view actually was about transcending a sort of dichotomy between naturalism and mysticism.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe people like me who are kind of like, come on, Jung, tell us, are sort of like, in thinking in a dichotomy that he himself might have thought to have transcended.
Well, okay, so I think there's a lot of I think it would be impossible to deny that being a scientist was incredibly important to him, and his reputation was incredibly important. So these kind of aspects of his experience were troubling to him in some senses, and he asked that the Red Book not be published. It just was published in 2007, 100 years later, because of that. But I think there's another component. And okay, so I'm obviously a fan of Jung, so I don't want to be overly charitable, but there's another component as well that is not like going back to the Gnostic idea, and this idea that so gnosis means to the Greeks and obviously I don't speak Greek, but ancient Greek, but it's like this idea of experiencing knowledge firsthand. So you kind of have to be embedded in this world of forms where something tangible lives that is kind of like we're kind of outside that a culture of belief where that seems plausible. But it's like an actual experience and knowledge of the divine would be what gnosis would mean, like that kind of experiential knowledge. And I think that was really important to Jung. So I think through psychoanalysis, if you kind of extrapolate his feelings about how he approached working with a client and then say like, okay, like it seems to me that he wanted you to experience his metaphysics as opposed to like having this kind of cult, which is developed anyways. There's definitely a cult of personality around Jung, right? Like, of course there is. But so I think that also make perhaps a charitable interpretation is but I do think that is important as well, is the kind of process of depth psychology was more important to him. And one thing that he said that was really interesting, and I actually think this is essential to understanding Jung, was that if you eradicated mythology, that it would spontaneously regenerate over time. Like if you killed all the writers, that it would come back in more or less the same form. So I think he was interested in kind of William Nava's experience of depth psychology and not coloring that and seeing how that would come out and if it would come out. And I think that's one way he kind of reconciled the kind of scientific and mystical in some senses, because we could probably, like we talked about Darren Brown, like we could create a very rigid kind of Jungian progression just with cognitive biases, right? Like we could just see it. We could just do it. And I think he was aware of that. And so I think some of the vagueness has to do with that. But there's definitely a component of being purposely obscuring the things that are harder to reconcile with, like, say, empiricism. Yeah, does that make sense?
It does. And I find that the idea that you said of his, that he thought that our myths would sort of recur more or less the same way if you got rid of them, to be really fascinating, because it sort of, it seems, it gives a kind of not just ontology, but like agency almost to the myths. It seems to me like a picture of these stories as like the characters sort of driving the human drama in a way where, you could of course interpret that metaphorically, but yeah, I don't know, the aspect of it that seems to say that they have that they have existence and agency seems to me to be a bit more than just metaphorical. So something else that I thought was interesting is that early, at the beginning of our talking about this, you talked about this possibility of people having lucid dreams that are shared.
Yes.
And so now we're talking about Jung, and we're talking about the concept of the collective unconscious, this shared pool that from which we draw our archetypes and complexes and the like. Do you know did Jung ever write about sort of shared dreams?
No, he didn't. I think one, let's say, not a problem with Jung, but like in his experience with others is he would like, if there's some kind of genius for like hallucinations, like he had it. Like he was so extremely visual, so he kind of shied away from like amplifying his dream. Like he didn't take drugs, like he didn't experiment with like mushrooms or like any kind of lucid dreaming tech, because he was actually frightened to do so, because his dreams were so terrifying to him, and visions, just spontaneous hallucinations in the middle of the day. Yeah, so I think that would probably explain it. Yeah, I think the closest, I mean, there's all kinds of, I mean, the closest to that world would be this kind of idea that I think has also been banalized, to use that word again, with is synchronicity, right? Like, which comes from Jung. And apocryphally, it's a story of this lady kind of reporting a dream of, it was an insect.
The scarab.
Scarab, yeah. And it like flies into the room and dies right there. And it's like, and from that experience, he, so I think that's kind of in the same, it's constellated around the shared dreams in some ways, because it implies a kind of, a shared experience between two people of something really luminous, let's say. But I'll have to investigate that more deeply. I haven't heard him talk about, or I haven't read anything about shared dreams. That is fairly contemporary. I guess the most, it's become really, I think we're getting more talk about it because of ayahuasca, honestly, which we talked about earlier, which, I mean, people are having shared hallucinations. And it's becoming harder to deny that, because how many people can lie at once? I think there's definitely it can seem plausible to me that like kind of one person says it and that like another person kind of had maybe a similar experience but kind of contorts their experience to match that. But it's become so prevalent and so visceral for people in just anecdotal reports that, I'm seeing more kind of contemporary chatter about it than I have in kind of my investigations in classical methods.
And that concludes today's episode of Who Shapes the Barber? Next week, Brian concludes by walking us through practical techniques for dream analysis and lucid dreaming. Again, I'm William Nava. You can check out other episodes, as well as my other philosophical and artistic work at williamnava.com. And if you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, go to williamnava.podbean.com. Thank you so much for listening.